I should say my name's David Bolt. I'm Director of the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies, and in that capacity I just want to say welcome to everybody and thanks for coming. Here at Hope, many of my colleagues and half of me are moving today, so we've got quite a funny situation going insofar as I think we're all a little bit stressed about moving, but also we kind of can't be in our lovely offices, the new ones or the old ones, so we're between two worlds for the day. So, you know, just bear with us if we look a little bit stressed. But it's really nice to bring a few projects here. Obviously, this is predominantly perhaps a CCDS gathering, but in particular today we are actually hosting this D4D project, which is led by Professor Martin Levinson, who will speak to you later on specifically about that. Just moving back a little bit, in terms of the D4D Futurity, which is today's event, we've done a little bit of work on disability and futurity already in the CCDS. Just to give a tiny bit of background there, I should just mention that we've got a multi-volume book project coming out on history, cultural history of disability. One of the volumes of that, I'll just mention one of the volumes, is in the recent age, as it were. What I'm trying to say is in the last century, predominantly. And that's edited by Mitchell and Snyder. And I'll mention it because we've got my colleague here, Dr. Owen Barden, has got a chapter in there. And that's an example of the work we're doing on history. And it's directly from that work that then we sort of started to try to think forward as well as back, as it were. And that's how we started to get into this disability futurity work. So I'll just mention that first. Another thing I'd like to mention is the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, which, as you know, is edited here. The most recent issue is the Biopolitics of Disability and Art Education, and that's guest edited by my colleague, Dr. Claire Penketh, and an external colleague, Professor Jeff Adams. And I mention that because I would point you in the direction of that. And we do have all the work all lined up in JLCDS. There are some copies there by where you've been having your tea and coffee this morning, which you're welcome to. And then I suppose that does point to a few things that we will pick up on today, insofar as a lot of new work certainly in cultural disability studies, but in disability studies more widely, is often initiated in that journal. And you know, I'm thinking back to the very early issues. I mean, you know, we've got Lucy Burke here. She was in the very first issue. Stuart Murray heralded his well-known book on autism in JLCDS. If we mention cryptistemology and so on, lots of things started in that space. So obviously, as you can tell, I'm very proud of that, but also very grateful to be a witness to that work. In that same vein, I should mention that now here the CCDS is in its 10th year, or officially it'll be in its 10th year at the end of the year. But 10 years ago this week, I gave an initial seminar here at Hope with some colleagues who I'm really happy to say are still here. I'm thinking most obviously of Dr. Laura Waite and Dr. Ria Cheen. We're both at that wonderful little event that became very quickly sort of controversial and no worse for it. But that was very much setting the scene for the CCDS, which was made official later that year. Doing this thing about the whole 10-year thing and so on, I'll keep coming back to that off and on. But I would like to say now that another work I'd like to mention now is Dr. Ria Cheen's new book, which is, I don't think it's quite out in its physical form yet, but it's all but out, so you can order it. There are some flyers about that book where you've had your tea and coffee. I would certainly encourage you to you know, engage with that. And again, thinking about the journal, how it paves the way for such work. I mentioned that Ria did a special issue on genre, which I would say set the scene for a book like that. Again, you know, it's really nice to be a witness to that work. In that same vein, then, I'll focus more on our keynote now. Professor Stuart Murray, I say Professor Stuart Murray thinking back now that it was just over 10 years ago when I introduced Stuart as a keynote at another event, and that was his first professorial keynote, which was fun. I remember we had a nice drink the night before, and he was saying tomorrow is my first official day as a professor. And I've got to say, you know, that is it's a fond memory, and we had a good night, and I think he went on to have a better night from my memory, because I think I was done by about 10 o'clock, and I don't think he was. But you know, it's always a pleasure to meet Stuart. You know, he's an important figure in the field. Some of you, I know that some of you were taught by him in relation to post-colonial studies and so on, so it goes back that far. I know that also lots of you would see him as your key mentor, and I think I do too. And certainly over the years, he's been a good mentor to me. Before I was in post, I would sometimes be writing to him on a daily basis. I must have been so annoying, but he never gave me that impression, and I do appreciate that still. And also thinking about this, the book series, the representation book series, which is really important. And again, that's part of that series that Ria Cheen's book is, and of course Stuart's own book on autism. Really great stuff, nice and clear, really important works in the field. And obviously today we're kind of doing something preliminary again, insofar as Stuart is going to be heralding new work again. So today, like I say, many of us will know Stuart's work through autism, or, as I said before, post-colonial studies. But today, this is where we're going to get more of an idea about how Stuart's work is developing. I think really I just need to get out of the way now, folks. But if you could just show your appreciation for Professor Stuart Murray.
Thank you to David for such a lovely, generous, but typically so introduction. That's very kind of you. I'm hugely happy to be here. I don't come here enough. Thinking back to the last time I was at the Centre and at Liverpool Hope, it is always a pleasure to be here. It is always a pleasure to acknowledge and witness the work that this centre and this institution has done and is doing in cultural disability studies. It's massively important. Scene setting not just in a national but also in an international way, and I'd want to pay specific tribute to David for all the work that he's done with the centre, with the journal, with establishing Liverpool Hope as a massively important place for the articulation of our subject. And I also would want to say how important today's topic is. Is there anything more exciting, more challenging, but equally more invigorating and hopefully with an idea of promise than talking about the future? So with that in mind, I want to go through a series of things which are heralded by my title, about, in particular, technology, the idea of the post-human, and disability as they fit into the future. I'm going to talk to slides, and I'm going to talk through the slides, and where there are images on the slides, I want to unpack some of those images as well. I think it's important to leave space for questions, so I'm going to try and keep to about 35, 40 minutes, so there will be time for questions afterwards. I hope I can do that. I can be a bit wordy, but I hope that works. So thank you for your patience. I've been thinking about futures a lot. So the book that's out next spring is called Disability in the Post-Human Bodies, Technology and Cultural Futures. What I'm doing here and using an image to showcase the book is an image from a company called the Alternative Limb Project, who make extraordinary bespoke prosthetics. And this one here is the image of a prosthetic leg being used by an above-the-knee amputee. And it is, I'm sure you can see even in that size image, sort of incredibly aesthetically complex and beautiful. And the way in which it morphs into what looks like a realist foot at the bottom, I think, is incredibly striking. I don't use it without comment or criticism, since it is a certain idea of a post-humanist disability future, it seems to me. It's incredibly high spec, it costs an awful lot of money, and so I kind of put it in as a sort of sense of a cultural symbol of what a disability posthumanist future might be, but equally one that may well be unattainable. So I want to kind of keep in mind that sense of access to certain futures as I go. So the other thing that is on my mind is that 1st of January next year, we start a project, a collaborative award from the Wellcome Trust called Imagining Technologies for Disability Futures. And that is Leeds in collaboration with Dundee, Exeter, Sheffield, roboticists, medical humanities scholars, engineers, and international partners across 3 continents. The image here is worth unpacking and talking to as well. It's a small child reaching out to take something from a robot arm. And it was used by the University of Leeds to publicise the award when we got it. My first reaction was not to like it very much. And what happened was that the press office at Leeds and myself went backwards and forwards on what was a suitable image. The ones they suggested to me were stock images of some kind of interaction between a person with disability and technology, and they were nearly always melodramatic or sentimental or full of a recognizable set of stereotypes and archetypes that we would know. So I vetoed them. The ones I sent them, they vetoed because they weren't press release enough. And this went on backwards and forwards until in the end I lost the desire to continue the conversation. And then our collaborator in Dundee said something that I thought was really interesting, because I was running the images by all our collaborators. And he said, the problem we can't find an image is because the image doesn't exist yet, and that's part of the point of the project. And I thought, yes, that's right. When we've done the project, maybe we can find the image. And that helped me to agree to this image, which is not great, but it is not bad. So in the end, I wanted the press release to go out. I would say in talking about futures, I just want to preface this, that to some degree, I'm going to talk about them as aspirational, as abstract. But I also know, and we all know, that they are immediate and material. They are to do with families and friends and communities. So I want to keep all those in mind as I go. As I was thinking and preparing this talk, I noticed that last week, the Royal Society published a major report called I, Human, and its subtitle is Between Mind and Machine. And it's an exploration of what it calls as neural interfaces. And I just want to read the preface of that report and talk a little bit to the report as a whole, because it is about disability futures in many ways. You may well not have seen it because it was published, I think, 9 days ago. So they say in the Royal Society report, neural interfaces, brain-computer interfaces, and other devices that blur the lines between mind and machine have extraordinary potential. These technologies could transform medicine and fundamentally change how we interact with technology and each other. At the same time, neural interfaces raise critical ethical concerns over issues such as privacy, autonomy, human rights, and equality of access. And the image that goes with this, which is an image from the report, is of a man with paraplegia who has a wireless insert in his spine that converts neural transmissions from his brain and allows him to walk. And the image is quite striking because it shows him in a series of 4 stages as getting up from his wheelchair and walking with assistance. On one level, it is a classic get up and walk image, of course. The oft repeated demand of and call to people with disabilities to rise up from their wheelchairs, if you like. On another, it is maybe an appropriate celebration of an extraordinary place we are with technology that is possible. I'd advise you, that sounds a bit preachy, doesn't it? I'd welcome you to look at the report. I think it's full of all sorts of interesting elements which are suggestive, demonstrative. They have what they call a call for action in the report, which is interesting as well. This again is from the report, where they say that potential future applications of these neural interfaces, this mixture of mind and machine, may include typing by brain and use of a mental mouse to control computers and devices, direct brain-to-brain communication, whether simple impulses or complex thoughts, and wider medical applications such as Alzheimer's disease and mental health conditions. One that is particularly mentioned in the report, and I think is pressing, is depression, the largest disability condition in the world, and something that the report a little bit lightly touches on as a way in which brain implants may be able to function. Monitoring of brain activity to support health, safety and security, which is the other side, if you like, because the idea of supporting health through monitoring, or particularly I think the idea of supporting security through the monitoring of brain activity is obviously rather loaded. There are already companies in China that monitor the mood of their employees. Officially they say it is to support them. It is probably not, shall we say. And the augmentation of human memory, concentration and learning, all of which I think have a number of obvious connections to disability conditions. And at the end they just say this Royal Society perspective takes a future-facing look into possible applications of neural and brain-computer interfaces, exploring the potential benefits and risks of the technologies and setting out a course towards maximising the former and minimising the latter. So it's an interesting balance. It's a pretty well written, and I thought it was particularly pertinent towards a conference around futurity and the ways in which technologies may be used, may also be risks towards disability futures. While I was reading this and thinking about it, I also reverted, if you like, to the more standard body of work that I know from cultural disability theory in particular. And I'm always drawn towards Robert McCrua's work, both in his first book, Crip Theory, and his more recent book, Crip Times. And these two questions that I take here from Crip Theory: what might it mean to welcome the disability to come? What might it mean to shape worlds capable of welcoming the disability to come? They've animated so many ideas in me about this topic, about the future of disability. And I love explicit, in those two questions, the notion of an explicit welcome to disability and the idea of centralizing disability, placing it at the center, if you will, in order to shape worlds, to foreground disability as a form of agency that can shape futures. So very much in my mind as I talk today, I'm asking I'm kind of reiterating McCrua's questions in many ways. What would it look like to shape that future and to welcome it? There are many ways, obviously given my background, I'm largely going to talk about cultural texts. It's where I feel most comfortable, so I'm going to talk about fiction and film predominantly. And there are many ways in which we can see these ideas of future disabilities in those cultural texts. This next slide is an image of James McAvoy as the young Professor X in one of the more recent X-Men films. You may also recognize, or think back to rather, similar images of Patrick Stewart as the older Professor X in the older X-Men films. And what's so striking in many ways for us possibly about this image is the technology of the wheelchair. The wheelchair presented as an incredibly sleek object, beautiful in so many forms. Petra Kuppers, his work you may know, has written a fantastic article about the appeal of the wheelchairs in the first two X-Men films, and about how as a wheelchair user you respond to them as fantastic objects, some plastic and see-through, others metal, carbon, molds. So I think what we have here is on one level the idea of this kind of beautiful constructed wheelchair, but what I've also called post-human techno-ableism. I don't have time to go into it, but you will probably know that the X-Men films are full of a kind of obsession with bodies, with the notion of mutancy, genetics and difference, nearly always moving towards humanist conclusions. And that is, of course, very typical of the majority cultural narratives which tell stories of disability and technological futures. If you don't know it, there's also a series of novels by Ramiz Nan, the Nexus trilogy. And there's an image here of the cover of the book and a rather intriguing double helix within a pill, because Nan's book is mainly about books are mainly about pharmacological interventions in which the brain is changed by the taking of pharmacological substances. Nan is interesting because before he was a novelist, he worked for Microsoft. He's the predominant guy who developed Outlook. And he's also written a critical book very much celebrating the idea of posthumanism. He comes to his fiction through an interesting technological software development background. His books are about, as I say here, body augmentation and extension. They too moved to canonical humanist conclusions about ideas of the integrity of the self, about romantic relationships, about the proper place, if you like, of the individual in the world as it develops. It's the kind of book where you can read 400 pages without even noticing. So if you've got a long train journey or something like that, give it a shot. It's both sort of laughably bad and intriguingly good, which increasingly I find myself enjoying. It puts me at the edge of my colleagues in an English department at Leeds who all deal with far more serious literature than I do. But there you go. I want briefly to talk about posthumanism. I don't have time to sketch the incredible range of writing on the subject which is available, some of which you may well know. What I wanted to do, though, was pull out this idea of what I call here productive posthuman possibilities. The amount of writing on posthumanism which says it is, in effect, an incredible possibility, beneficial possibility of thinking about the future. And so what I pulled out was one of, I think, the better books on posthumanism, a book just called Posthumanism by Pramod Nair. And he says, and this kind of iterates a whole set of arguments that I tried to pull out as I say these sentences, where he says that humans, non-humans and machines are now more or less seamlessly articulated, mutually dependent and co-evolving, and that in having these positions, they redirect the energies of traditional notions of the human. So instead of the idea of the centered figure of the human as the center of both society and discourse, if you will, critical posthumanism posits the non-unitary subject, and it offers a more inclusive and therefore ethical understanding of life. There are so many trajectories of posthumanism. There are conservative accounts by figures like Francis Fukuyama. There's the incredible feminist technoscience tradition that runs through Donna Haraway and into Rosie Bradotti. There's the species interaction work of Kerry Wolfe and others and others. Many of them contain arguments not dissimilar to this, that there are productive ideas of assemblages and networks which refigure both the idea of the body and the interface, and this goes back to the Royal Society report, doesn't it? The interface between body and machine, mind and machine. And what I found myself interested in the book I finished is the clear parallels between that and a disability reading of a body, which also interacts with machines, which also breaks boundaries, which also, I think, offers fantastic critiques of the ideologies of humanism. So if you can kind of roll with all of that material as this productive notion of posthuman possibilities, I'll move on from it. All of those things said doesn't cancel out the fact, of course, that for many people the idea of a future with disability is not one that it is understood to want. I'm drawn to Alison Kafer's work on this in her excellent book, you may well know it, Feminist Queer Crip, where she says, fantastically, caustically, she says that there is this assumption that a good future naturally and obviously depends upon the eradication of disability, an assumption that this kind of elsewhere, one without disability, is one we all want. It's a very clever quotation, I think, because what she does in the book is, of course, she unpicks that, but acknowledging the prejudices behind this idea that we, a majority culture, all want a future without disability, and that we would not wish to embrace that in any way. It's a long way away, isn't it, from McCrua's notion of welcoming the disability to come, I think. And of course you all know that branch of posthumanism or transhumanism which seeks to eradicate bodily difference or perfect bodies in the future is very much operating in these kind of terms. It doesn't want a future of disability. There is, though, I think, the beginning of interesting theory around the complex embodiment of disability, to borrow Tobin Sieber's famous phrase, and the better aspects of posthuman thinking. And that's coming out in small ways around notions of materiality and matter. And I've just pulled a line or two from an important collection edited by David Mitchell, Susan Antabi and Sharon Snyder, which is out just this year, called The Matter of Disability, Materiality, Biopolitics and Crip Affect, in which they say, posthumanist disability theory offers an opportunity to produce a substantive theoretical reworking of the repetitive employment of impaired, read socially marked and biologically determined as undesirable, bodies as diagnostic tools of things gone awry in their social and environmental contexts. And though they don't go into it in much detail, I was drawn towards this idea that a posthumanist disability theory, which I like to think in many ways is what my book is, offers opportunities, is not simply to be critiqued as an idea that disability and technology can't go together. And so they continue in a similar way that this idea of the materiality of the body, what they call matter, such matter returns disability to its proper place as an ongoing historical process of materiality's dynamic interactionism. It situates disability not as deviant, but rather as evident of the excess that marks materiality, agency, and reaches beyond the realm of the cultural while shaping its formulations. And I like the end of that quotation in particular because that very much seems to me, in that idea of reaching beyond the realm, as an example of welcoming the disability to come. And so I think that trajectory, particularly with its focus on the materiality of the body and an understanding of the productive nature of bodily excess, I very much like that formation of how it can conceive a relation between, as they say, posthumanist thinking, posthumanist practice, if you like, in the development of engineering technologies and the understanding of disabled agency. I just want to close with some examples from the body of work that I think most interestingly exemplifies this, and that is science fiction. So I'm aware with Ria Jean, who literally has written the book on this, sitting in the corner, and I'm so somewhat tentatively moving towards her ideas. I want to talk and pull out some quotations about how we can use science fiction, think about science fiction, work with science fiction, if you will, to think about these questions of disability and subjectivity. So Catherine Allen's collection, which is, again, utterly formative, I think, Disability in Science Fiction, that she edited. In her piece, Reading Disability in Science Fiction, she says, SF has long explored deviant and disabled bodies and is inhabited by people and aliens whose embodiments are situated along the entire spectrum of ability. No other genre comes close to articulating the anxieties and preoccupations of the present day as clearly, as critically as SF, making it a vital source for understanding advances in technology and its impact on newly emerging embodiments and subjectivity, particularly for peoples with disabilities. And the last half of that last sentences about advances in technology and newly emerging subjectivities and embodiments takes me and my mind back to the Royal Society report again and the things it's trying to hope for in a disability future. Equally, Cheryl Vince intriguing book, Bodies of Tomorrow, which is about subjectivity and technology and science fiction, says something not dissimilar. The new selves SF might help us imagine are both problematic selves and unexpected others. They remind us of the fragility of our boundary-making work and that the other always is an aspect of the self made problematic. So the link between bodies and psychological states, if you will, in which self and body are always in some way interacting, and here we're back with the language of a critical posthumanism maybe, within ideas of, say, a Deleuzian notion of assemblage, or networks in which the other and the self face each other off. And technology as that idea of a meeting point of body, human, machine, non-human, while also practicing, I think, that fantastic idea that Donna Haraway, the question that she asks, why should the body end at the skin? And that idea of a theoretical, if you like, but also an actual prosthesis in which the body extends beyond the skin. And I'm going to give a few examples from the work of Becky Chambers. I do want to ask if anybody's heard of her. Right, because I don't think she's that well known. Would that be fair to say? Just as a generalization. I couldn't come across any critical work on her, but I write extensively about her in the book. She's written 3 novels, a trilogy called the Wayfarer Trilogy. The third one of which, Record of a Spaceborne Few, came out last year. The various ways in which the books are described on the blurbs are fantastically underwhelming. They say things like, one of them, Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, actually says charming on the back, you know. And I'm thinking, no, this is actually fantastically sophisticated stuff. It largely comes, the disability in technology and embodiment largely comes through this second novel, A Closed and Common Orbit. And I just want to outline some of that now, and hopefully do so coherently, because it narratively is a very complicated book. So I'm going to have to sort of bounce around and try and be articulate about some really quite complicated narrative interweaving. Firstly, Chambers' work is space opera, so it's set far away on planets with all sorts of different technologies. In her novels, personality is fluid. It is full of polyphonic associations. So characters can change biological sex, they can move between genders, there are romantic relationships between humans and AI systems, etc., etc. Interestingly, though, even within a world in which body morphology is so common, disability as difference runs through the works, particularly around connections to embodiments. Closed and Common Orbit I'm also interested in because it's about the engineering of technology, and its central characters are all women. And I think this is hugely important in a science fiction world where often the Frankenstein story, if you will, the creation myth, is largely of female bodies made by male scientists, female characters made by male authors, if you will, that frequently revolve around male violence and the notion that the process is some way for often a sort of broken and beaten man to resurrect an idea and affirm an idea of self. Chambers doesn't do any of those things, and it makes her work, I think, absolutely intriguing. Very quickly, the central character of A Closed and Common Orbit is an AI called Sidra. She is made to pass as human in order to escape a authority that is chasing her, and is placed in an exoskeleton in which she appears to everybody else as human. She eats, she goes to the toilet and all of those things, but these are in fact fake. What she has, therefore, is she has a sense of herself as being disabled. She much prefers the AI self from which she comes. She calls herself in her exoskeletal form stunted. And it's a fantastic play on an AI character who takes technological but human form but wishes to return to an AI state. Now, on one level, it sounds like it's just another reiteration of that Cartesian duality in which the body is meat and the mental state is preferable. But it's got a further twist on that, I think, because what she is trying to do, what Chambers is trying to do, I think, is show that in fact this is a critique of the idea of the centred body. The centred body is not the thing to which Sidra wishes to return. And I think this idea of the alien, if you like, or the AI, becoming human and very much wanting to disavow that human status is something that I find very interesting in science and speculative fiction. Some of you will know Michael Faber's novel Under the Skin, which similarly, an AI who is made into human considers herself to be disabled by the processes through which that has taken place. The two narratives of A Close and Common Orbit are Sidra's and a woman called Pepper, who is her creator, who engineers her. And they move together as the novel runs. They have alternate chapters until they meet. Pepper, originally called Jane, is an unwanted and abused clone who comes from a highly disabling environment, as does Sidra. For both, there is no kind of humanist return. At the end of the novel, Sidra achieves her ambition to go back to being an AI, but she does so through meeting another AI. And they, in fact, merge to make a single AI consciousness. So thoroughly undercutting, if you like, the centered notion of an individual humanist, or even in this case, non-human self. The two AIs come together, but Sidra reserves the right to return to her exoskeleton when she wishes. So the concluding self is one that is dispersed, I think, non-unitary in that posthumanist way, across a variety of locations. It is an assemblage, again, to use that word. I think this is a really good example from fiction, of Alison Kafer's desired notion of an intersectional future, the disability-led confirmation of what a disability body in an environment might be. And just to close with another line from Robert McCraw, which I think brings us back to some degree to the things I hope have been apparent in the talk all along, where he says the disability to come will and should always belong to the time of the promise, a promise to comprehend disability otherwise and collectively somehow access other worlds and futures. And I think it's such a resonant statement. It talks, I think, to a way of animating theory. I think it's behind a lot of the ideas, the thinking of through here is behind a lot of the ideas that McCraw obviously worked up in thinking with others around epistemologies. I love the way, though, about the notion of accessing other worlds and futures, which seems to me very evidently to talk of science and speculative fiction and their idea of what this might say. And I think the notion of the promise, that which we aspire to, that which we would wish to be in, if you like, is something that we might all find ourselves wanting to belong to, in being optimistic and positive about thinking through what a disability future with technology might be, and a way of welcoming the disability to come. Thank you very much.
I'm Lucy Burke, I'm part of the D4D team, and thank you to Stuart. That was really, really fascinating. One of the things that I think characterises a lot of popular sort of science fiction today is the motive of the divided world. So in a lot of texts you have a kind of profound sense of inequalities of wealth, and they're often sort of played out in terms of literally living in different worlds. So if you think about a film like Elysium, for instance.
That's exactly what I was thinking of.
But it also happens in texts like Mind Scan, which is about the downloading of consciousness. You can see it in Altered Carbon. You can see it, I think, in sort of Blade Runner films, where you have that sense of profound sort of economic inequalities. And I wonder whether actually it's impossible to think through these kinds of depictions of technology without actually thinking through their relationship to profound inequalities of wealth and access to technology as well. And I wonder if that's going to be an aspect of the project.
one of the things I meant to say in glossing the Royal Society report is that it takes for granted an idea of health economics, which is fundamentally based around the notion that you can access health if you have the funds to access health, and that this is global, that to be healthy, to have well-being, or what Nicholas Rose calls, the politics of life itself, is determined by the current economic world order. And although the report knows that, it points to the ways in which research around technology, say at universities, now completely goes hand in hand with collaboration with industry. Or particularly the great example, of course, is DARPA in the US, the American Defense Department's spending of billions and billions of dollars on technology to facilitate the US military. Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right, Lucy, and I'm thinking of, not just those films, a film like Transcendence, the Johnny Depp film where his consciousness is downloaded, but even more widely the Marvel and DC universes, which are just saturated with wealth. I remember the first time I watched the X-Men films, even the first 2 or 3, the school for the children is modelled on a kind of Ivy League architecture. Everything about it sort of suggests this notion of wealth. I think the understanding of the situated centrality of that health economic system actually does underwrite all of this technological development. And of course, at heart, it will leave people with disabilities behind. If that's a pessimistic view, because there is so much, in a way, there are reasons to be optimistic about what technology will be able to offer people with disabilities. The reason to be pessimistic is to look at the past and see, in fact, that these things, which have always existed in a form of promise, have not happened, I think. In direct answer to your question about the project, yes, because we're working with a lot of groups of people with disabilities, and we're designing things, and we have in mind, and always have had, questions of the way in which access cost is a major issue. The group of hospital users that I work with at Leeds, for example, the prosthetics and orthotics users, most of them, I'd say about 70% of the group, have in fact no longer use prosthetics. They just couldn't be bothered, is a fair way to put it in the end. It was too complicated, too difficult. The objects they were given to use were not useful. And so I think, in all of this sense of high-tech possibility, the fact that so many people were choosing not to use prosthetic legs, to return to wheelchair use just because it was easier, is something we have to bear in mind.
Just to make a comment on that, I think it's not
Can you just say who you are, please? Sorry.
Sorry, Bob's Blackwell at my student. Just to make a comment on what Stuart said there about how it's not unusual now to find people with prosthetic limbs decide and choose involuntarily to not use them because they can be a hindrance. That's happening in a lot of other domains. I work with many deaf people, profoundly deaf, and they won't wear hearing aids. It's £2,000 worth of equipment. And what you find is a lot of the money in finance and research is going into people who haven't got disabilities or any needs whatsoever, and they're making the decisions on how things are being progressed.
No, only to agree. I could provide other examples, but you probably know what they are.
Reaching Liverpool. Thank you for a really interesting talk. I've got many things I could say, but I'll just say one. And it seems to me like the discussions of prosthetics, post-human technologies, and so on in disability studies is often kind of got stuck. So there's a reaction against the sort of perhaps somewhat naive optimism that characterized some of the earlier non-disability studies work on the possibilities of post-human technologies, future technologies, and so on. And there is this insistence upon recognising, well, actually, you know, we can talk about this, we can talk about these potentials, but, you know, if people are waiting 2 years for an appropriate wheelchair, or, you know, so many months for this, kids aren't getting stuff until they've grown out of it, and they're not able to access these technologies. And I think sometimes that has been a kind of sticking point in disability studies and cultural disability studies work. It's like, you know, although yes, actually, this isn't really relevant to many people's lives apart from a privileged few. And it's just like, well, where do we go forward from that? Because I think you said something about optimism. And I think there is something important about looking at these things hopefully and optimistically, because we kind of close down possibilities, don't we, by just saying, well, but is it really worth thinking about this, because it's not actually much use for most people. And before you respond, and I'll get Holly to take the mic back to you, I'm just going to say that some of us are tweeting today using the hashtag D4DFuture. So if you're on Twitter, you can follow along. Please add your own thoughts on that.
Thank you, Ria. Yes, absolutely agree. Both about theoretical contemplations of the relationship between technology and the body, and the point of getting stuck. I think the getting stuck moment is because too often we want our critical accounts of disabilities to solve everything. So therefore they have to be about science fiction, about Deleuzian theory, and about the NHS all at the same time. And they can't do this. And so I think, and here I would, in the nicest possible way, continue that critique of the social model of disability, I think, which always asks us to come back to questions of environment and usage. I would hope that, say, those of you in the room who are students feel you can write on science fiction and its representations of bodies and disability and not necessarily think of that. I don't think, and hear the work of, say, Mitchell and Snyder in this new, you know, and their new ideas of materiality and biopolitics, I don't think there's necessarily a contradiction in talking about materiality situated groundedness of disability experience and theory. But it doesn't mean you always have to answer the question of what does this mean when we talk about whatever you might think of as the real world. I'm interested, for example, some of you may know the work of Margaret Shildrick, who does fantastic notions with Deleuzian ideas of bodies and prosthetics, but she stops at the point in which she is asked about real-world implications. She kind of says, no, I'm not going to do that because I do not believe in a notion of the body, in effect, she says. You know. And so her work is still sort of incredibly enabling, but she doesn't feel the need to solve those problems. So I think, yes, I think Ria, there's a couple of things. The early work on posthumanism, take something like Catherine Hale's, was so useful, I think, when you read back on it, for disability studies, even though those links weren't being made then, because it said posthumanism has to be thought of as embodied. And I think when you say embodied, you make a bridge towards theories of complex disability embodiment, even if you don't know you do. I think it's foolish to practice a critique of something called biomedical science, which is too common, I think, within the arts and humanities. Scientists do this. Medical models of disability say that. Fair enough. But medical models of disability might be the things that help people with paraplegia to stand up. And we make huge mistakes if we assume that's a bad thing. If there are going to be neural implants that help people with the forms of epilepsy that drugs cannot work, if it stops them from having seizures, I defy anybody to say in some way that's an example of a scientific model we would not want to engage with. So I think it would be foolish of us not to embrace science, not to work with scientists, as I am now increasingly doing, who understand these questions as well, and who want to come to people in cultural studies and literary studies and listen. So I completely agree with you. I think we shouldn't be stuck. And I don't think we have to be, and I think good work will get past that.
Okay, well, thanks, folks. Can we just show our appreciation for Professor Murray again? And,